Annabelle, a little bit about how Horace viewed his filmmaking and his screenmaking, because I mentioned that you're going through his photography archive. Mm-hmm. He did say that photography in the eye of a photographer was always in his film work as well, wasn't it?
Yes, I think absolutely. I think I'd like to start by sort of framing Horace's early life, because that was absolutely crucial to his creativity and to his visual sense. So Horace was born in Trinidad, as probably everybody knows, in an area called Belmont, which was a very multicultural area. Trinidad generally is multicultural, so he always felt like he knew the world. He sort of had that innate sense in him that nothing was foreign, so to speak. And then in the Second World War, our revered Churchill decided to lease a part of the island of Trinidad to the Americans for them to do their guerrilla training with their soldiers and whatever. And for that, we got 7 battleships, apparently. But anyway, apart from that, the important thing was that then there was a huge influx of Americans, which then created a cinema. So there were like 50 cinemas when Horace was a young boy, and Stefan, who's in the audience. And this was just magic to them, so their lives were just filled with cinema. Not only Hollywood, which was interesting, but European cinema. So, Horace had seen Fellini and Antonioni and De Sica, everything before he'd even left Trinidad when he was 19. So that kind of framed his love of cinema, and his way of seeing things very much came from that kind of realist cinema and that outward looking. He was always outward looking. One of the other interesting things we should talk about before we start seeing some of his work is he did work on the film Cleopatra with Elizabeth Taylor, and that had an impact on where he went next, didn't it? Tell us about that. I mean, the story has different versions, but the one I sort of remember best is that he and Mustafa particularly were extras. The production started in England, apparently, and they were extras. I think they were slaves, probably. And then Liz decided she wanted to change her lead and have Richard Burton as the lead. By now it's getting to winter, so they had to change the location, and they went to Italy. And certain of the extras were invited to go as well. So Horace was one of those, and I think Mustafa as well, possibly. And so he was a slave then on Cleopatra in Rome. But being in Rome was absolutely crucial to him. One, he absolutely loved Italy. He felt so at home. The people are friendly and love music and eating, and very much reminded him of home as opposed to London. And then there was all this cinema to see. So, he used to go to Cinecittà, and he used to tell me he was in restaurants with De Sica and this one, who knows. But very much that was what was going on. And then coming back from there, he then went to film school.
Excellent. And of course, in the 60s, Britain is a really interesting time for all the radical activism and movements, some of which we start to see reflected in his dramas. I wonder, Peter, if you want to give us a little bit of a sense of the world that was potential, the TV commissioning, things like, Play for Today, and some of these one-offs that Horace was able to get work in.
Whatever we think of the BBC, there has been no public broadcaster that has had a track record in drama, an innovative drama, which is than the BBC. It just didn't exist. There was a slot which went on for years, first called the Wednesday Play, and then Play for Today, which started off all studio, multi-camera, until a director called Ken Loach said we should make one on film. And film then was 35 mil, which was so expensive, nobody could afford it. It took forever to get a shot in. And Ken Loach said to the BBC, we should make this on 16mm film, like the New Wave in France. And they looked at it, and the BBC came back to Ken Loach and said, I'm sorry, it's not transmittable on British television, 16mm film. So they went out, and this could not happen today, and bought a 16mm camera. Yeah, they bought it, booked one studio, shot the whole thing on film. And when it was transmitted, it got the highest viewing figure of any play for today, or Wednesday play it was actually there.
Cathy Come Home.
Yeah, and this is Cathy Come Home. And that was the first all drama, and that's what took off. And then for about 10, 15 years, the British film industry was in television.
Yeah.
And that's where David Hare, that's where Mike Lee, that's where all of them made their
that's
work.
really
And that's was open there for somebody like Horace.
Fantastic. So what I think we should do now is we're going to look at a little montage of clips from about 3 of Horace's dramas. And just remember, he worked in drama, he worked in factual documentary, he worked in kind of music features and arts, a huge range. And the 3 that we're going to see, and you'll see him introducing, speaking about them as well, from an archive interview he did. The first one you'll see is A Hole in Babylon, which is a 1979 play for today based on a real event, the Spaghetti House siege, and there was controversy at the time over using real news footage intercut with a dramatic reconstruction inside. We'll talk a bit about the context of that drama. There's also a kind of satirical drama called Playing Away with a Carol Phillips screenplay from 1987, which was set around a charity match in a fictional Suffolk village with invited South London players. I think it's set against the background of an African famine week. I will talk about how Horace could do satire alongside comedy and hard-hitting social realism. And then the third we're going to see is an extract from The Orchid House. Lenny James in a breakthrough early role. And this is a 1991 Channel 4 commission based on a novel adapted by Jim Hawkins, set on a Dominican plantation at the end of the First World War, about 3 white sisters returning to their Caribbean birthplace and the decline of their once wealthy planter family. Let's have a look at the clips.
Nobody had tried to research it and find out a little more about what made them do it. Because when I started looking into it, there was a medical student, there was a writer, who was involved. And I started to think that they're not hooligans. They're not just black guys that wanted to stick up a restaurant. And even so, if they were black gangsters, I don't think they would have tried to get away and not pull off a coup to demonstrate their politics and everything. So I took an interest and started to research it and found out a lot more about it. So what I tried to do is to tell the story of these people before the siege and what they were trying to do and how they were trying to actually set up a black school and educate black kids about black subjects and culture and way of life, and nobody will support them and things like that, and how it went wrong and what took place and why it went wrong. So at least one had a bit of information and depth about those characters and those people who were real.
We've told them right from the start that we will not negotiate under these terms.
So there is no question of them walking out there and going anywhere other than to a police station as far as you're concerned?
We've told them that they can come out at any time they wish as long as they put down their arms first.
We've said before, they're going nowhere. We're not meeting any of their demands except those that are compatible with their own well-being, the well-being of hostages.
The 2 men are Lilo Termine, 33 years old and Italian, and a 48-year-old German nightclub owner. They'll appear at Bow Street Magistrates Court tomorrow. Another man is still being sought. Today's events confirm our original belief that this was an ordinary armed robbery with no racial or political connotations.
It's all over. We are wasting our time.
We've still got the hostages. They have to let us go sooner or later.
Not now. They will never believe us. The people will never believe the politics now. Not with all these people involved.
You got to take us serious. We got to carry on.
I've had enough.
So what do you want to do?
Send the hostages out, then we go.
What? Are you mad?
Don't call me mad.
Look, if we go out now, they'll treat us like common criminals. I'd rather go out fighting.
There are a lot of them out there. They will shoot us down like rats. Me, I know I will get life in prison. You guys will still be young when you come out.
You're forgetting what we're here for. I don't mind dying for the cause. And I want to take 1 and 2 Babylon with me, too.
Think of all the black people who'll be letting down. They'll use it as propaganda against the black struggle in this country.
We must complete our mission.
Look, I am not arguing. I am in command here.
Like hell you are.
How is it? I don't bloody believe it! Are they paying you? Is this one of your missus' ploys to be nice to the darkies? Well, is it?
The rules of the game say that I determine whether or not the batsman is out. In this case, he's not out.
Bloody hell! Are you gonna play the game or what?
Come on, Ian.
He's not out!
Hey? Right. That's it.
Hold hard, Ian. I'm on my way as well. Come on, lad.
But Dad, you can't just... Oh,
Over! Look here. You can't do that.
You are plainly still a man of conscience. But His Lordship the Bishop feels you are taking a wrong course. Perhaps prompted by the hasty action on the part of some people. His Lordship wishes me to ask you to return to your former role as teacher. And he does this in a spirit of Christian tolerance.
No. No, Father Toussaint. I fear I cannot accept. I already have a job to do. I have a pupil.
So. Baptiste, I hope you will never regret throwing away this opportunity. Come, brother. Let us depart.
I saw it as a sort of challenge at first because I've never really worked in the television studios. I never really worked with television cameras and television setups. And Peter Ansorge, who was a very young Peter Ansorge at the time and a very pioneering young man, was trying all sorts of things, and he thought it was time for a black filmmaker to come and make, and direct the series, which was about black people, and bring new ideas to it, which I did, and again, which created a lot of confusion and madness up at the studios, because when I got there, a lot of people who were in charge were very shaky that he invited a West Indian to come and do this without having any knowledge of television, which I thought was nonsense at the time, because television grew out to film and I was making films.
So obviously, at the end there, Horace was talking about Empire Road, which was the kind of first soap opera really focused on black families. But I just wanted to talk about, to go through it in sort of a bit of order, the Hole in Babylon. First, I should say the Playing Away, the cricket one. You could have called it White Men Behaving Badly. Young Neil Morrissey in there. A Hole in Babylon. So it was a real sort of, how would you describe it? It was an armed siege.
Yeah, the thing about the whole, this was a play for today, and this was a play about the Spaghetti House siege, which was, and all the newspapers, most of television broadcasts, portrayed the black people who did the Spaghetti House siege as pure criminals, gangsters who were just out for a laugh, wanted to do something horrible. In fact, they were doing it as a political statement, and these arguments still go on today. What was really beautiful, though, about A Hole in Babylon was that they had taken over a spaghetti house run by Italians. And even though they were the crooks, through the film, there's a warmth and a shared thing between the black people and the Italians, which is not sentimental, but is moving. And I think that you can't ignore the way in which a serious film about serious issues has to also engage the audience emotionally. And that's how Horace did it, as well as presenting a completely different view of the Spaghetti House siege than we'd ever seen, and one undoubtedly nearer the truth.
And that whole idea of using fiction and news footage is something which drama docs do so much now, don't they? Marcus, what were your thoughts about any of those?
I think what's so important with Holding Babylon is that invariably black people need to be spotless, deserving victims. And so if you look at Rosa Parks, there were people that had not gone to the back of the bus previously, but they weren't as seen as deserving and as pristine as Rosa Parks. And what I love about Holding Babylon, and then if you look at works like by Richard Wright, for example, is that it's normally only through a black author that you're able to get that humanity where it's not the deserving victim. You know, so you see that in Holding Babylon, where you see the complexities of I don't want to say undeserving, but there's a complexity to it. In the same way when you read Black Boy by Richard Wright, you know, there's a complexity to it. It's not these very simple tropes of goody, baddie,
black and
victim,
white.
black and white, precisely. So that's what I think he's able to get across in nearly all his work. You know, the idea that there is a complexity, and as opposed to when you see other people doing programs about racism, whether that's scripted or unscripted, the black people need to be these absolute downtrodden, spotless victims, and it doesn't ring true. Our lives are complex, and he's able to capture that complexity, which is so important.
Tara, I want to talk to you about Empire Road, because that series kind of spun off out of a work that you'd commissioned. Can you tell us a bit about it and its importance?
I think what Marcus says is absolutely right. And Black Christmas was written by Michael Abensitz, and it's about a black family celebrating Christmas. And I think it resonated with audiences because precisely that, there was nothing, these weren't particularly wonderful people or bad people or gangsters or anything special. They were an ordinary family with all the things that an ordinary family do at Christmas that people could relate to. It was beautifully written, with all the character and all the complexity of the family complexity, the family dynamics. And I think that's why it worked so well, because people, I feel often that there's a feeling that, doing drama involving black people, it's very difficult, we don't know how to do it. Actually, I don't think it is that difficult, because I think people respond to drama that engages them. And I think if they see characters that they can get really engaged with, they don't sit there thinking, they're black, I don't know who they are.
They get engaged with the people.
They get engaged with the people, and they see that the people are just people whose stories they want to watch. And I think that it was the spin of that, and because of the atmosphere that there was at BBC Pebble Mill, where things could be flexible, David Rose recognized that Black Christmas had done very, very well, and so therefore was open to suggesting to Michael, or whether Michael suggested it, we could do a soap which has people like this, and people will watch it because they'll want to watch the stories about these people that they can relate to.
Because it's representing the genuine diversity of Britain.
Yes, and
but also I think like the normal.
So you just let Tara finish, or did you want to finish?
What I'm saying is, I don't even think that there was a conscious idea that it was going to represent diversity. It was simply going to represent people, and the people and the stories that people would engage in, which is in the nature of soap. People have to engage with them, and so the fact that these people weren't white, when most people were used to watching white people in these situations, I don't think it was a breakthrough attempt in that way, but it was a breakthrough, obviously, because it was completely unique.
Sorry, Peter, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that we did Black Christmas, and it was shown on BBC Two at Christmas and got a really good audience, surprising audience, and that's when we were able, David Rose, to come up with the idea, well, we'll do not a follow-up to Black Christmas, but that sort of characterization as a soap opera. And Brian Wenham, who was the controller of BBC Two then, welcomed it. There wasn't a hugely hostile thing, because at that time, the drama department was organised that one person, given they had a budget, could say yes to a writer.
Oh, that's a whole other lost world.
Yeah. And that made a difference.
Yeah.
And they weren't sort of sitting there saying, oh, he's doing these black things, these weirdos. Brian was incredibly supportive, which is why we did a second series.
Just partly because of the amount of time, and I want to show more clips, I wanted to ask Annabelle a bit about playing away, because what struck me was Horace's ability to just range across tone and types of drama, because there's real comedy and satire, even in that little clip we see. And I'm interested, he'd made, Pressure, back in the late 70s, and this is 9 years later. Actually more than 10, 15 years later. Could you tell us a bit about what you understood about how Horace could work across all these different ideas?
Well, Horace, to me, essentially was an observer of people. That was his interest, why they did certain things, how they got out of situations they were in. The other thing is Horace had a fantastic sense of humor. I mean, he made the most silly jokes. Everybody will testify to that. But he did have a fantastic sense of humor. So if he could ever, and he could always find some little bit of humor in no matter how horrible a situation it might be, he would find something, some little gimmick or somebody's twitch, or he would always find something in it. So I think he was interested in people's emotions of all across all spheres in that way. And the idea of doing a film about cricket and humour really got to him. He thought that was fantastic, because obviously cricket is a West Indian thing. This was, I can't remember, it was just after or during the period when the West Indies were really lambing it to the British. Yeah. And he loved that, so he wanted to really capture that. And then, of course, it's more than that. It's the complexities of the class situations within the village itself. And Kaz Phillips did a brilliant job of capturing all those different nuances between all the different, not only between black and white, but the different stratas within the village, and, the snobbery, and, why they threw Neil Morrissey off and all that sort of stuff.
One of the things I loved is, even in just those few clips, in every single extract, you could see the focus on the faces and on reading the thoughts. There's an intimacy which he masters with the camera, and that comes from his understanding of photography.
I think that, I know he's a documentarian, but Horace was a real artist of cinema, fundamentally. So he could go from documentary, and what he always talked to me about was the environment. And the environment for him wasn't just the background, it was a lively character in itself.
Yeah.
And so everything, we change it, move it, you know what I mean? Yeah. But he said that is what actually influences people. And it's not just documentary, it's where you are, what you've learned, how you've grown up, why you're in a spaghetti house holding up,
Yeah.
And he understood why. And also his eye was unique, because I've worked with a lot of great directors, but what he did have, that was the background in cinema and stuff, was a cinematic eye that really, really great British directors of the time did not have. So it was an artistic thing as well as a...
Well, what you've done beautifully is set us up for going into looking at a selection of his documentary work. And I'm going to kind of give you a bit of context before we see them. In 1969, he made a film called Baldwin's, I want to say N-word. He would have used the N-word, and Indeed, James Baldwin would have used that word, and you're going to see it in the caption for the clip, in which the African-American writer James Baldwin, in conjunction with the civil rights activist and comedian Dick Gregory, discussed the Black experience and identity in Britain and America. And it was filmed at the West Indian Student Centre in London. So it's kind of, you're there in the room with them, and it documents a lecture by Baldwin and a Q&A session with the audience. So that's going to be the first clip. Then we've also got another example of, it's like a documentary, but it's actually satire. It's a World About Us, and it's Black Safari, and it's a group of Black explorers coming to try and map and discover the strange, unknown world of Britain. So you'll enjoy that. And then the third is a documentary which was produced by you, Annabelle, wasn't it, on the Bhopal disaster, Who Shall We Tell, which was made a year after the terrible Union Carbide disaster, which reveals something we already know, that Horace had this real passion and interest in other cultures and in what was going on in the wider world. So let's have a look at these clips, and then we'll talk again.
On the plea is a very simple one. It's saying, look at it. Forget all the mountains of nonsense that have been written and everything has been said. Forget the Negro problem. Don't write any voting acts. We had that. It's called the 15th Amendment. We don't need a Civil Rights Bill in 1964. What you have to look at is what is happening in this country. And what is really happening is that brother has murdered brother knowing it was his brother. White men have lynched Negroes knowing them to be their sons. White women have had Negroes burned knowing them to be their lovers. It is not a racial problem. It's a problem whether or not you're willing to look at your life and be responsible for it and then begin to change it. That great Western house I come from is one house, and I am one of the children of that house. Simply, I'm the most despised child of that house. And it is because the American people are unable to face the fact that, in fact, I am flesh of their flesh, bone of their bone, created by them. My blood, my father's blood is in that soil. They can't face that. And that is why the city of Detroit went up in flames. And that is why the city of Saigon was under martial law.
Have you ever been discovered? White men were always discovering us. But we humored them, we carried their luggage, we showed them what they wanted to see, though we never understood why they killed things and refused to eat them. They wrote down their impressions and sent them home to their friends as the truth about what they called darkest Africa, boasting how they had found our rivers and our lakes, and even naming them after their own chiefs, like Victoria and Albert. But things have changed. It is time we too had our Livingstons, our Mungo Parks, our Stanleys. It is time we in turn explore the homeland of the white man.
Land ahoy!
Our purpose on this expedition was to locate the geographical center of the remote island of Britain, marked vaguely on an old map as Greenwich Mean Time.
Hard at starboard!
This is the coast of darkest Britain, of Lytham St. Anne's, 1972. An absolutely scientific survey approaching from the west coast.
There she goes!
The 2nd of December, 1984, was a day much like this one. It was early morning in Bhopal. Sunil is one of the survivors of the gas leak, facing a grim and difficult future. He lives in JP Nagar, the shanty town literally across the road from Union Carbide's chemical plant. Carbide's activities in collaboration with the British date back to 1924, when they controlled the battery market. Today, it is pesticides. Humphreys and Glasgow, a British multinational, were given the engineering task of building the Bhopal plant. Reports in the Indian press state that initially Humphreys and Glasgow raised objections when it became clear that Union Carbide intended to cut costs. They knew these modifications would be unsafe, but went ahead nevertheless, after being overruled by Union Carbide Corporation in America. When approached in London, Humphreys and Glasgow refused to comment, referring us back to their subsidiaries in India. Built in 1969, the Bhopal plant employed 600 to 700 people.
Let's start with that last clip first, on Annabelle and then Tara. I'm interested, Annabelle, you produced that, and it's only a year after the Bhopal disaster. How did Horace come to want to make that, and how did it happen?
We had a very good friend, a writer called Marla Sen, and who's obviously from India, and we were all horrified by the events that had happened. It was in December, I think, December the 2nd, the year before. We were all horrified by it, but we hadn't really thought there was a possibility of getting in there that quickly. Marla, she was a great researcher and she was determined. And so she and Horace actually went off together, I think maybe 6 months later, and actually got into Bhopal and started to talk to people and meet people, and eventually came up with 4 or 5 different families, because again, Horace's way of telling a story wasn't just to do a sort of chronological thing about what happened, but to find individuals tell their stories. So you really got the intimate look at what happened to them and how it affected them. And they came back with all these amazing stories and stuff like that. And again, thanks to Channel 4, we got the money to go back and do it. So we were there pretty soon afterwards.
Yeah.
It was pretty horrendous.
It was, and it's an important piece of work. Tara's thinking as well, it's so obvious throughout Horace's career how often he was telling stories that, whether in Britain or internationally, had a connection to South Asian peoples and culture. And what sense did you get of that affinity?
Well, I think that the strength of good stories is how they're driven by the author's voice. And since these things are very close to him, he invests them with all the strength of his voice and something that's very close to him. Obviously, even when he's doing the white cricketers, he can understand them, but he's also dealing with the black people who are playing. And I think that it's probably, it's just the author's voice. And I guess his anger fueled the Bhopal thing, because, you know, he wasn't from Bhopal, but he had some connections in his background. And I think it's that. I think that's what drove him and gave him the energy to drive these things, to make these things at a time when it wasn't obviously given to him on a plate.
It's very well said, isn't it, Peter? Because there's a sense of how he deals with an anger at injustice.
Yes. But it's also very important to know that he came from Trinidad. And Trinidad and the British were really, really ignorant about their empire. They thought it was all black. But the Asian community in Trinidad is as strong. And the fact that you have V.S. Naipaul, whatever you think of as a novel, as one of the great English novelists, Trinidad. So Horace would have also grown up with the Asian community and really knew them as well. So it wasn't just...
He was half Indian. His mother was pure Indian.
Yeah.
Well, pure Indian with a bit of Scottish, actually.
But I think that's very, very important, because he was those identities.
Yeah.
So he was from Trinidad. He had the Trinidad identity, but if his mother was Indian, plus a little bit of Scottish, just to mix it up a bit.
A bit of pretty much everything.
And that, which I suspect is what made him gravitate to Italy when he got to
well, this
Italy,
is what I
and
said.
could just blend in, go to Cinecittà, take it on board, and accept it as just another identity that he could.
Just felt at home because
Yes.
he'd been so familiar with all, so many different people.
Marcus, it's funny, again, even just watching those clips, you just have a sense of the playfulness of Horace Ové in his work, like The World About Us, The Black Safari, even just from that short clip. I just love the way the woman is like looking at the map really seriously, and, the detail. And then, Baldwin's N-word. It's in that, even in that clip we saw, James Baldwin is talking about that it's not a racial matter, the whole issue about violence in America. What's your take on how he uses documentary?
That's true, but I think we need to recognise why we're here, that it is a racial matter, right? So the reality is that the reason why we're here is because he was, and I know this is, I just want to say it explicitly, is because he was a revolutionary in terms of documenting the Black British experience. Now, he documented lots of other experiences, but with hindsight, it seems obvious that there's a Black British community here. But it wasn't obvious that it needed to be documented and that it was important. So it's really important to recognise that it's the 75th anniversary of the Windrush. Mm-hmm. The Windrush was not the first ship that came from the Caribbean, right? It was the third ship, right? The other two weren't filmed because it wasn't deemed important. So we don't have the other two. We have a Windrush generation because people filmed it, right? And it then became history. Similarly, we can look at Horace Ové's work, and it's like, well, of course there's a Black British community here, and of course it's really important to be filmed. But it wasn't obvious. It wasn't obvious that it needed to be documented. It wasn't obvious that it needed to be filmed. And to recognise that it needed to be filmed, to recognise that it needed to be documented, to recognise that we were not just some kind of transitory blip that had come on the Windrush and we're all going to go back to the West Indies, right? To recognise that we were important and need to be documented. I can't stress enough just how, as I said, it's easy to look from where we are now and be like, well, of course, it wasn't obvious back then, and he does that whether he's doing that in.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And pressure, the opening of pressure, one had never seen anything like that in film. And it was set today. It was a black kid growing up with his mum and his dad. Yeah, and what do we first see? Him eating bacon and eggs. And then there is an uncle who actually points out this is a terribly unhealthy background. And so that you immediately engage in it, but you never had seen that before. What is it like to be a black kid in an environment where people really didn't understand it, even his parents?
Tara?
I was going to say that you are absolutely right that it needed to be documented and it hadn't been documented. But I think that somehow what we were saying before about his multiple identities showed him the way of doing it, because he could present these people, document the experience, because in some part of him, he was absolutely part of it, but also he was part of a few other aspects of life. And so therefore, he could choose to document that and just think it was totally valid without being necessarily on a crusade. And I think that's why he was very successful at doing it.
As someone who worked with him on so many projects, what was it like producing Horace?
I think you should probably ask Peter more than me. I mean, we had a very good, obviously, close working relationship. I mean, nothing was ever going to be straightforward or, whatever, but it was always exciting. It was always thrilling. You always learned something new. I mean, I was assistant producer on Pressure. That was my first ever film job. I didn't even know the difference between a producer and a director, much to his horror. But it was a baptism of fire, and I learnt. And then I became fascinated by the process, actually. And his projects were always exciting.
They're so different, weren't they?
For me, a little white woman from Trinidad originally, this to me opened up different worlds that I would never have imagined I would have had part of. So everyone was thrilling. And they were all a challenge. I mean, they're all now here and we see them, but each project was difficult to get going. It was never straightforward.
Wow.
Because he was always trying to do something in a different way. He was always trying to tell a different story. Pressure was a nightmare to get produced. Thank you, BFI. But, the budget was something like £15,000. They didn't really want us to do a good job with Pressure, to be honest. And then that's another story. We'll go into that later.
Stay for the next panel for that one.
Next panel for that one. But, nothing was straightforward or easy. There's a background story to everything. Peter will...
In terms of a director getting through a schedule, Horace was unique because he would suddenly spend a lot of time shooting this fire. You see, Horace were behind, and he used to get behind, but then he said, we've got to find Kasha. And then he found a way of doing a couple of shots which got you through the day. So it was dramatic in itself to go on a set with Horace.
And to be in the editing room with Horace was no easy thing either.
Okay, tell us about the editing room then.
Well, longer was always better. So it was very good if you had 50-minute slot, right, Horace, it's got to be 50 minutes. I mean, it was a struggle for him. He always wanted to put that little bit extra. Well, they're not going to really understand. I said, they do understand. It's okay.
He wanted to show everybody completely.
Every detail.
And of course, I mean, with Playing Away, Kaz is here, so he'll remember that. I mean, the first cut was hours.
Yeah.
And gradually, but in a way, that's also that opens up possibility in the editing room. And that if you have covered everything, which Horace did, you can then have the flex. Isn't that true, Tara, do you think?
Yes, well, lucky if he had a producer who'd let him do it.
Well, that's what they had at Pebble Mill then.
Right, why don't we look at another section of clips? So we talked a little bit about Horace's, home world of Trinidad, and the Trinidad Carnival was something that he always had a great love of, and he went on to document the early days of the Notting Hill Carnival. So we've got a little montage of clips around his work in arts, and again there were these fascinating documentary strands, weren't there, where you could basically make one-off films where the director had a lot of say. We're going to show a couple of clips.
The World About Us was an amazing strand.
Yes, which was where
Black
the
Safari was
an
World
art
About
commission.
King Carnival was World About Us, and also Skateboard Kings, which we're not seeing any.
So sadly, we're not seeing a clip of Skateboard Kings. We made a great documentary on that.
They are showing it later this week.
Excellent. And King Carnival, we are going to see a clip of. So what we're going to show you now is a clip of his 1970 film Reggae, which was shot at the kind of big Wembley Festival of music. Really important. In fact, I've just been reading a history of Two Tone, which talks about the importance of that film on showcasing the incredible impact that reggae was having in music. And then we have a clip of King Carnival, which does look at the early days of the Notting Hill Carnival. And then we have a clip of Trinidad. And then we have a clip of Full House, which was from a BBC art series and showing the range of musical culture going on in one particular pub. Is that fair?
That's right, Coleherne Pub.
Where was that pub?
It was in Earl's Court. It's called Coleherne Jazz and Cascade Blues.
Excellent. Well, let's have a look at the clips and we'll talk about them.
And I set out to actually, in a sense, to educate the British public of what that music was all about and where it was coming from. And that was really, really an independent West Indian movie, because another friend of mine who's Junior Lincoln, had just started producing reggae music here, Bamboo Records in Stroud Green Road, and we got together, and he actually put up all the money to do this, all his savings and all the money he had been making off of records and things, and we got together and made reggae. And to our surprise, also, it was shown in the cinema, and then the BBC actually bought it and showed it on BBC too, and it took off from there, and it traveled all over the place. But it was a little before its time, but still people got information about the music. And also it was the first film, I think, that we actually had skinheads. First time skinheads show up in a film, because again, the whole skinhead movement was just started, and their main music was ska and reggae.
Most of the reggae records, what they call the protest records, are banned in Jamaica. In the same way as the slave master banned the tom-tom in slave times as a message that communicated rebellion between slaves. And as such, today we find official society placing themselves in the tradition of the white slave master, banning reggae records. And on the other hand, the disinherited Jamaican people, having developed out of the tom-tom, faced with modern musical instruments, being able to harness all that technological discovery and channel it into a West Indian music, and as a result of that, reggae emerges.
I want all you skinheads to get up on your feet. Put your braces together and your boots on your feet, and give me some of that old moon stomping. Get ready. We got 3 million miles to reach on the moon. So let's start getting happy now. Ready? Yeah, 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 yeah.
To what extent does reggae appeal to white youth in Britain? Well, the skinheads accept it, and in doing so, they have rejected something else. They've turned away from the middle-class, existential, mystical, hippie-style music, which is unable to cater for their social needs.
I set out to make a film about a people and its culture and their rhythm, and to use their rhythm and the way they see things and the way they move and the way they, the way they articulate things visually or verbally and everything, and to capture that and make the film like that, which I did, with some of my own sort of ideas into it. And I had problems at the time, and some of the people that I was working with was not too happy with it. But in the end, I think I finished it the way I would like to finish it, and it worked out quite well.
Among pre-carnival competitions, the judging of the kings and queens of the bands is certainly the most spectacular. These remarkable creations are constructed to fit a single wearer, who will parade them in front of the grandstand for several hours on Dimanche Gras, the Sunday before Jouvet, in the competition to choose Queen Carnival and King Carnival. Jupiter, superstar, ruler of the sky, from the band Secrets of the Sky. Splendid savage of the sea, from the band 30,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Zeus, god of all gods of all Greece. Bird of paradise. The enchanted vampire. Birdman's Paradise, from the band Birds of the World. Satan, from the band Mamadou Kamas.
One of my main reasons for playing at the pub on Sunday mornings is to entertain West Indians. When I say entertain them, I mean play the type of music that they look forward to hearing, which they're unable to hear in other parts of the country. West Indian rhythm is a complex rhythm because it's something from the Africans, it's from the Cubans, and it's all mixed up. It's from Europeans. West Indian rhythm is really a complex rhythm of different nationalities. And that's what we play. Why I like going to the pub. You really feel, you get a nostalgic feeling of home. So it's a sort of place where one can get an address of a lost West Indian friend. And that's the meeting place, really. Plus, I can play what I want in this place. The other jobs I go on to, They might be worth more money-wise, but I'm restricted. If I'm playing for a handball, most likely I have to play Scottish reels and different, stick to Cole Porter or the trend of the day. But there I can play what I want.
Immersive dives, aren't they, into each of these different worlds. There's a great cryptic moment when Horace Ové is talking there about King Carnival, where he says he was having some difficulties at the time with some of the people he was working with. I wonder if you could offer any insight.
Me, I don't know anything.
You don't know.
Actually, when I got to know Horace when he was doing a parade, because we were all up in Birmingham, nowhere to go, he showed me the documentary. I'd never seen the documentaries, and we screened King Carnival at the BBC Pelham Mill Studios, and it was just him and me. And when he suddenly talked about the background to Carnival, all the elements that are involved in history, I had no idea. And certainly Horace was one of the few directors, actually, well, I don't know about few, but he taught me more than I actually knew through entertainment.
I mean, we don't really get a feeling of it from that clip, because that's just
but it's
about
wonderful.
The
it just comes
It
alive.
shows you all the colour, but the carnival is a mixture of African rhythms. He goes into the history of the indentured Indians and what they brought to carnival. They brought their own rhythms, and also they brought that sense of colour and glitter and all that. The processions, like the Tajas and stuff. So that he talks about that. He talks about the Europeans and what they brought, and of course it's based on Mardi Gras, so you've got the French. So he really goes into the history of the whole thing. And I think that's what's unique about that as a carnival film.
I think that's right.
Trinis are very hard to please, but they loved it, and so they were very happy. But I think what a bit of the conflict was, it was a co-production between World About Us, BBC, and there was a German co-production involved as well, and I think that was what caused a little bit of complexity.
Marcus, what did you want to observe about these?
I was going to say, so I saw, because I knew I was going to be on the panel, I saw King Carnival the other day. And I think there are links with regards to King Carnival, and if you looked at the previous stuff with the Black Safari, because what he's, although one is satire, what he's doing is that he's still explaining a black perspective to a white audience. He's there's an inverse, he's perverting what at that point had constantly been happening, which is, as far as I'm aware, if Carnival or if stories, when I'd seen stories about Jamaica set in that time, it was through a white prism. It was white documentarians doing that. And so what he's doing, I think, is so interesting when you watch King Carnival. Seeing those three clips together. So I think that's really interesting. And he's, but also what I think is interesting, seeing those three clips together, is recognizing that he has an identity in transition. And this is what I find so interesting about he captures a black British identity in transition, in that King Carnival clearly shows his Caribbean, West Indian, Trinidadian heritage, and he's a Trinidadian. At the same time, you watch those two other clips, and this is a uniquely black British experience that he's capturing. And then what I noticed in the last clip is there's talk of home, right? And it's the use of home where the musician is talking about home, but home clearly being referencing the Caribbean, in that. And yet it's whether that really was home or whether there was yet to be the recognition that the home was actually Britain and the home had actually shifted without them quite recognizing. So there's a really interesting. What you get when I look at his films, is a transition of a black identity, of being a Caribbean identity, of being a black British identity, recognizing the other influences that obviously come into it with regards to what you're saying earlier with the South Asian, and unbeknownst to me, Scottish as well, you know. But it is such an interesting identity in transition, and he's able to approach it with an honesty, which is fantastic, and it's been able to capture that.
Yes, you're right. He's capturing something in transition, because
absolutely
people of that generation hadn't yet started to acknowledge that home wasn't maybe where they had come from. Home was. I think that was really interesting. Also, I noticed there was a reference to Scottish reels in that.
Oh, I missed that
thing, wasn't it? When he talked about the kind of music he'd be expected to play elsewhere.
Yes, that was Russell talking at the pub. Yeah, when they had to play at Hunt Balls. God. That's where they made the money.
Yeah,
obviously.
and reggae. I mean, the footage of those young skinheads. It's something that we so rarely see, because again, over the years, we've tended to see a very simplified idea and a very divided, racialized idea, and it was much more complicated, wasn't it? I thought that film was so nuanced.
Yeah.
Did you have any observations about it?
Yeah, I thought that to do that, you know, the skinheads weren't really known then, but to show them doing reggae, that is Horace. He spotted something before anybody else. Somewhere in him was that ability to observe and to do that.
Because he says quite interestingly, you know, the folk hippie music of the time didn't serve their needs.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. So they found something else, which might not.
Profound observation.
Yeah, it actually is, isn't it?
Yeah. And this is 1970 he made that. That's 9 years before you think about the kind of big peak of two-tone records and things. So it's remarkable.
I think it was the first reggae concert that was filmed. That's what he always said, anyway.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. And also, again, I just want to ask a little bit about the world of TV commissioning, in which these art documentaries can be made, where there's
I
so
think
intelligent.
what's come out of this evening that's not as the thing is what the BBC and our public broadcasters has lost is the one-off. The play for today, the arts documentary, the documentary, the one-off series documentary, has almost gone, because broadcasters at the moment want series. They want brands that people will just turn on. It's a little bit simplistic, but that's gone, and I think we should think about that.
Yeah,
but particularly Full House, which was an arts program, was an extremely anarchic, breaking all rules kind of program.
This was the one about setting the pub.
No, Full House.
The series.
Yeah. Oh, the series.
Full House
Yes.
was the series.
It was an arts Saturday night
right.
arts program, but it wasn't like any arts programs that the BBC had ever put on. All kinds of anarchic people got in charge of it and did whatever they wanted in the studio. And so they probably commissioned that, but that would have been because it was a very brave slot that probably only survived for one series. I mean, I've seen 2 or 3, but I don't think it lasted very long. It was like letting people loose in the big studio, and they did some really interesting
Horace
stuff.
did another Full House program. He did something called Black Blast. There was a play called Black Blast, written by Lindsay Barrett, and they filmed that, and that was a Full House program.
Sorry, Marcus, you were going to say.
I think while it's important to recognise the structures, such as the one-off, play for the day, which has been lost, it's also important to recognise the things which haven't changed. So what was so interesting for me is that I became CEO of the film and TV charity. I officially took my role on the 18th of September, and Horace, that was a Monday, and Horace died on the Saturday before, so 2 days before. So I took the job, and I realised that we had to do something. And so I quickly called the BFI, called BAFTA, called RTS, just to find out if they were doing anything for remembrance in the next coming week, and found out that they weren't, because they're doing this event in a few weeks. So no shade on the BFI, you're doing great, right? But so a week later, the film and TV charity held a kind of a gathering of black film creatives and other people who had who wanted to remember Horace Ové. What was interesting is that many people of that generation, of Horace's generation, were talking about the challenges which they faced, and they were almost identical to the younger generation that were present. It was like nothing had changed in terms of they were talking about the problems getting commissioning, the problems of authenticity, the problems of making sure that their authentic voice was heard. Lots of things had changed. Don't get me wrong. So I'm not saying there's been no progress, but it was really interesting hearing some of the people, some of the older generation talk, and then also because there was several generations at that event, at that gathering, and just seeing those similarities and the same challenges which were facing Horace to get those stories told, and similarly the same black filmmakers today, younger generation.
Well, you brought us nicely on to talking about his legacy before we take audience questions, which is, as you said, there's not a linear sense of, well, it was hard then and things have got easier. It's more complex. I wonder what all your thoughts are on the legacy of Horace Ové's work. I don't know if you want to go.
Well, I'm not sure that is completely true. I mean, I'd never heard the word diversity until a few years ago, where television producers and everybody, we have to be more diverse. And I think you do see more black film. You do, that has changed. For me, what is lacking a little bit, and this is me, and you'll probably hate this, is the extraordinary talent that Horace brought to things that other people wouldn't. It wasn't following the lines. He thought for himself, he knew stuff, and he brought an originality, which perhaps we're losing a little bit.
It's tricky, isn't it? I mean, I think of someone like Steve McQueen,
yes,
who's had such an impact,
he's
particularly
great,
with his
yes.
small acts films, but how recently that's been, and how much he'd had to do to be given that creative freedom now. I mean, the fact that we can single him out.
Sure.
No, what are your thoughts, Tara?
Well, weirdly, Steve McQueen comes from an entirely unexpected arts background,
yes,
which I suspect.
It's true.
I mean, I'm only sort of thinking at it now, but he had established himself as a unique, original artist.
Yeah.
He always used video art from very
No, but what I mean is that was his world, and so then I think probably that when he went to the commissioners, they weren't just getting a script, they weren't just seeing a black person with an idea of the script. They went, oh, this is a really interesting guy, and oh, he wants to do some drama, and then they, in a strange way, became more open to it, which is, I suspect, how Horace operated,
yes,
because he came from things in a way that people weren't expecting. He didn't come in and say, I've written this script, isn't it good? Would you like to commission it? And they go, I don't know. It kind of dives through a door, and then once it's gone through the door, people go, oh, it's really interesting. But I think, and I'm only thinking about Steve McQueen as you mention it, that because he was an arts person, a person who wasn't trying to make films for television.
I see it. Yes, that's right.
He was a person who did extraordinary videos that looked like Buster Keaton, and people didn't know what, you know what I mean, and had an identity of his own. And then I'm sure that when he went in to say, well, you know what, I'd like to do this series, people thought, well, that's really interesting. And I'm sure if he'd come in with 6 small acts films and said, I'd like to do the series of these films, they would have gone, oh, well, it's a lot of black people and a lot of films.
Peter,
I think, no, I hadn't thought of that, but I think that's true. That to get a commission, which has always been difficult, though they weren't called commissions in our day, you need to bring something else to the table that isn't simply, I've written the script, would you be interested in reading?
I just think it means people look at it differently. They think, oh, this guy's a really respected international artist.
Yeah, exactly.
And then they talk to him, and then they think, oh, it's a really interesting idea.
But that's a high bar that black people need to jump over.
Yeah, I don't think it's
I think it's true of white people too, actually.
I'm not suggesting that it's bar, I'm just saying that
I'm not
it's
sure.
not that easy these days.
I think there's there is some disagreement about whether it is a higher bar. But also something you said earlier on, Annabelle, which was Horace was always trying to do, so everything was different. There wasn't like, and I think that eclecticism in his imagination is part of what's so fascinating about looking across his body of work. It's so exciting.
Yeah, I can't sort of talk about his legacy in that sort of sense. It's sort of close to me. But when I look back at the programs that we were actually able to make and what he was able to make, I think actually we lived in a very fortunate period in terms of television and broadcasting. I mean, Channel 4 started during early 80s, was it?
82. Yeah.
82. That was a moment of such high hopes and expectations.
And you also had on that, Channel 4, when it started, Jerry Isaacs had a multicultural department specifically to commission that.
That's right, Sue Woodford.
And Michael Gray kept it up and backed it. Then the third person who came to run the channel abolished it and said that's because we've solved it. It's happened.
When was
And
that?
for 20, that was Michael Jackson in about the late 90s. He abolished the multicultural department, and for about 20 years you never saw a black face on Channel 4.
So I was thinking, was that about the time they made 4 Weddings and a Funeral? Anyway. Thank you.
It's the old Chris Rock joke that he is an internationally well-known star and his next-door neighbour is a dentist. And that's how it can sometimes feel. Yeah. But, I mean, I don't know if I'm answering your question seriously. I can answer your question seriously.
The issue about commissioning.
But what was really interesting about the different generations, and it was a really beautiful, even if I say so myself, it was a really beautiful gathering, was the power in gathering. And so what some of the older people were talking about was the fact that they found strength by meeting each other and setting up their own production companies and working together and networking together. And not only was that support in terms of getting commissions or working creatively, it was an emotional and support for mental health and everything else as well. And it was amazing how many people were there that were saying that Horace gave me this break here, Horace gave me that break there. And so it was recognizing that he didn't pull up the ladder behind him. That he was constantly helping, and they were helping him. It wasn't just a one-way transaction. The Black and Asian creatives, South Asian creatives, were working with him, and they were working together, and they were stronger for it. And so, similarly, if there was something which I thought that other generations can learn, is that we are stronger together. I know that's such a cliche, but that was what was coming across loud and clear when I heard their stories.
Supporting each other and networking with each other, and yes, bringing on the next generation that way. Peter, did you want to add anything here? And Tara, any advice or thoughts on this?
No, I mean, when you say the bar is high, it is. It's not, I wasn't saying that it should be. It's very difficult.
Just believe in what you want to do. Believe in yourself and believe in your project. Don't ever give up. That's what Horace would tell you.
That is actually true. Let me say this to that you have to have a bit of talent. Without any talent, you can't do. Can't write dialogue.
You have to have more than a bit.
Well, you don't know. It's just then what you have to do is you'll be turned down a lot. Now, even very famous writers I've worked with spend most of their life complaining that their best work's never been done. So you have to be persistent. But these days, you can't piss people off. It's sort of writers nowadays didn't behave this well. And by being persistent, it means that if you get someone to read a script, don't phone them up the next day and say, have you read it yet? You have to give them a bit of time to do it. And then the third thing, and this is pretty ludicrous, if you keep and you are persistent, you have a bit of talent, the last thing you need is a bit of luck. And curiously, luck happens, but in ways that you'd never expect. So Horace wouldn't have worked out a career plan. You know what I mean? People who work out career plans doesn't work.
Thank you. I think you've hinted at something which is to do with gatekeeping to some extent, which is still a problem about who gets across the line. And I mean, the number of times I've had writers say, with a selection or something, they've been told, well, we've already got a black writer or a Asian writer for this, whatever the month is, or, and it's just that there's still this idea of quotas by some people, even now. And so gatekeeping is the other side of that, isn't it? It's not about the lack of talent, it's about who lets people across the line and on what basis. I don't know if you want to take that.
I just want to say something because I'm worried we're going to run out of time and there's a point that I really want to make. Okay, real quickly. I think what's fantastic about Horace Ové is that he, and you just mentioned the word, Samira, is community, in that we often do have more black representation now. So you have the Luthers of this world or whatever. But what he had and what what Menelik Shabazz did as well, and what, if you look at Small Axe, what that also does is it documents not just the individual black protagonist. It represents a community. And I think that is what's so powerful. And if you look at Pressure, if you look at some of the work, the reason, and so the example that I often use is that in 1971, 2 children's program series started. One in America, one in the UK. Both had black representation. One was Double Deckers, right, which had black representation. It was a black individual. In America, Sesame Street, which was black community. One of them goes down in history, and one of them, I think the people under 40 haven't never heard of, right? Yeah, people like shaking their head here, right? And so it's the strength of documenting community rather than thinking that black people are isolated individuals, which is what's so strong in Horace's work, what's so strong in Menelik Shabazz's work, and which is so strong in Spike Lee's work. It's documenting that community, and I just wanted to get that across before we ran out of time. And
no, that's a great point to get across.
I got my first job through Chedo.
Through
Chedo, the Black Film Collective. That you had Menelik, you had Ujebe, you had Dennis Davis, and so when we talk about the gatekeepers, we need to also recognise it's gatekeeping to funding as well. Because invariably when we have that discussion about gatekeepers, it's always about gatekeepers to the commissioners, right? Whereas, Chedo was able to make its documentary about Broadwater Farm, and then it had independent funding that, I'm going to get this story slightly wrong because I was 17 at the time, so, I got it third hand, or I got it second hand, but whatever. But because they had independent funding that wasn't through Channel 4, they had the strength to burn their rushes because they did not want their rushes to be used to incriminate what the Metropolitan Police wanted to be able to seize them. Right? Now, if they had only got their funding from Channel 4, they wouldn't be able to do that, so therefore they were able to maintain their link with the community when they did that. I don't think there's any black film independent that would have the financial model now to be able to do stuff like that. Now, I know I've gone slightly off the point of Horace Ové, but I think the whole funding model of how you can get the Horace Ovés, how you can get the Menelik Shabazzes, is ones that we really should revisit or explore.
I do think you need that generosity of spirit that has to come from the top to finance the arts. And one of the paradoxes is that apart from banking, since about the 1950s, film, TV, and theatre has been the most profitable industry that we have. But now we have actually a government, let's face it, that doesn't believe that. that doesn't want to invest in the arts. And that is definitely an issue, because the early Channel 4, when we were at Pebble Mill, we had development money, and it wasn't a lot, but it was a lot more than you get at the moment with an option, you know? It's true.
Yes, I just think the problem is particularly acute with for black people getting through and the gatekeeper. But I think it's an atmosphere and a time when it's quite hard for anybody to get their
You're
voice
right, and
through.
it's not even as simple as people talked about streaming would change everything, and then you saw how quickly streaming was using algorithms to only fund certain kinds of things. So
Absolutely.
people are being turned down straight away on the basis of the algorithm says
Absolutely.
no. We're going to finish with a clip of Horace Ové, which I think is a nice way to look forward. But I wanted just to ask you, Annabelle, having heard this whole conversation, and how, one, I'm just so grateful that and glad that you're here to celebrate Horace's work, but what he might think about the conversation we're having about where filmmaking goes and his legacy.
I think he would be delighted that this is, sorry, I'm going to start crying now. He's going to be delighted that this is happening. I think he would probably be very argumentative about every point that's being made, because that's just the nature that he was. But he would have been very excited, very enthusiastic about young people and trying to do everything in his power to make young filmmakers like these two in Bantea, to help them forward. Absolutely.
I'd like to think that there's an exciting time ahead too, and as we know, governments change and politics changes. So who knows what kind of conversation we might be having in a few years. Before we end, going to end with the voice of Horace Ové, but I want to thank my panel first: Peter Ansorge, Tara Prem, Marcus Ryder, and of course Annabelle Alcazar. Let's give them all a big thank you. Thank you as well for being here. Don't forget, Pressure is getting a screening and there's a panel discussion to follow. But let's end with some more words from Horace Ové.
I want us, as black people and creative black people, to take films and to do with films what we have done with music, black music has reached a point and has always done so, to that creative point where it's so incredible and beautiful and perfect, and it works and it takes you everywhere. And I want the film to do the same thing. Black films must find its style, just like they found it in music and dance and sport, but take it further.